thank you everybody for joining the session today, the third session of our series on theories in management research. So to talk about institutional logics, meta-theoretical framework for analyzing interrelationships in the society, conducted by Dr. Sasika Manoratna, a senior lecturer from the Department of Management and Organization Studies from the Faculty of Management and Finance, University of Colombo. This is in a way a continuation from the previous session conducted by Professor Arusha Gunaratna on institutional theory. So institutional logics, as we got to know, is part of the institutional theory, another branch of institutional theory. So, and I have heard that it's a very popularly used theory in management. So thank you very much, Dr. Manoratna, for agreeing to do this session for us. I know you're not well also today, but still for all, you agreed to conduct the session. So thank you very much. Dr. Manoratna's research interest lies in sustainability, spirituality, and ethics, and we will get to know how she has used institutional logics in these areas. So over to you, Dr. Manoratna.
Thank you, Dr. Arusha, for having me and yeah, for giving me this opportunity. So I'll, without further ado, I'll straight away start off sharing my screen. Okay. I hope the screen is visible. Is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Right. So as Dr. Arusha mentioned, I will be talking about institutional logics as the meta-theoretical framework which helps us to analyze the interrelationships in society better. So to take you through this journey, this is the roadmap I have thought I would pick up. So I will first give you a background as to just to locate institutional logics perspective in the broader institutional theory arena. And then we will go through how institutional theory evolved. And then I will situate institutional logics. And then we will define what institutional logics perspective is about and why especially it's called a meta-theoretical framework, going by the fundamental principles that qualifies ILP or institutional logics perspective to be considered as a meta-theory. And then I would take you through some of the empirical studies that have been done in different areas, mainly just introducing those to you. And then we will delve deeper into one of the studies which I did for my doctoral study, which I directly used institutional logics to explain the interrelationships in business as well as how it really translated to the society. So I will basically take the principles that we talked about and will take you through this application process to make it more concrete. So getting started with the background, I thought at the outset, it would be better to clear the definitions, the terminology, so that we can keep it out of our way and then focus, and also it will make better sense of what we are discussing, especially for the PhD students who are new to institutional theory and institutional logics perspective. So first let's start by saying, by trying to understand what institutions are. So according to Scott, institutions are social structures that are characterized by a higher degree of resilience. So these are social structures, and institutions are very powerful because they stand and weather the say the challenges and the evolution, and are quite strong, stand strong in society. And if you go by Thornton and Ocasio's definition, which is more elaborative, they identify institutions as supra-organizational patterns of activity rooted in material practices and symbolic systems by which individuals and organizations produce and reproduce their material lives and render their experiences meaningful. I know this has a lot of words. This is a loaded definition, but let's see how we can really make sense of this definition going by the important things that I have underlined. So you need to keep in mind, institutions are supra-organizational patterns of activities. These are not just mere organizations. These stand above and go beyond organizations. That is what it means by supra-organization patterns of activity. And here I would also like to stress, these are patterns of activity. This is not spontaneous. You're not just making decisions all of a sudden, but these are patterns which have been used and reused and have been passed along over generations. Like institutions last for a long time, and these patterns of activities are passed on to the next generation. So we go by the rules, the regulations, and these are transmitted from one generation to the other. And these also include material as well as symbolic systems. So we will get to clear out what these materials and symbolic systems means, this duality, shortly when we get into the crux of institutional logics perspective. So we just, for the moment, we'll leave it aside. And then the next thing I would like to draw your attention is to the individuals and organizations. So by these individuals and organizations, we stress on organizational and institutional actors, right? So whose behavior are we talking about? Whose behavior are these institutions are shaping up? It's the behavior of individuals and groups of individuals which constitutes organizations. So here we are focusing about organizational actors, mainly individuals, and how groups of individuals or organizations, their material lives are produced and reproduced. Here again, it shows the patterns of behavior which are passed along from one generation to the other, right? So which makes the decisions that they take, the behavior meaningful. So basically, this is the idea that you need to keep in mind when you talk of institutions. And some of the examples that are brought out through institutional logics perspective are family. Now we all know you and I belong to family, right? So that's the basic institution of any society. So family is considered an institution because it contains a pattern of activity. It reproduce and reproduce. So there are ways and rituals, practices that are adopted by families. So family is such one fundamental institution that lies in the social fabric. And also religion. Religion is considered an institution. So the institutional theorists have identified the state, maybe the bureaucratic state, and markets, corporates, professions, which have their own practices and their own, ways of doing things and standards, legal mandates, etc. Those are professions, which are again considered to be institutions, and then the community. So we will we will work through this. We will have a deeper look at these institutions, especially when we develop the conversation further on. And institutional theory which talks about and identifies why institutions, why do these individuals who are associated with these institutions behave the way they do, is what is explored through institutional theory. So institutional theory is a widely applied theory that we come across, especially in institutional theory, as well as in sociology. So I hope the definition on institutions and institutional theory is clear to you now. Let's proceed. So now I would really draw your attention to the evolution of institutional theory. I know Professor Tarusha, in her previous presentation, she presented about institutional theory. So as institutional logics perspective, as Dr. Arosha correctly mentioned, is an offshoot or is a branch that has developed. So it builds, institutional logics perspective builds on institutional theory, but it departs from institutional theory as well. So it's quite distinct, it stands distinct, it's different from institutional theory. So through this journey, we will see how similar institutional logics perspective, how it connects with institutional theory, how it emanates from institutional theory, and how it departs from institutional theory in the story that I would unravel to you. Okay, so if you look at institutional theory, its history goes back to early 1950s, where you see the work of Philip Selznick, his empirical analysis, the book published on TVA, that stands for Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States. So having a public administration background, Philip Selznick look at how the society shapes up the organizational actors. Remember, the organizations and the individuals, their actions, especially through a public-private partnership. So that book is a classic, but this classic is so hard to read. It's a very I don't know. It's very so difficult to read, but he shares his insights about the actors' duality, the role they play. So they mean something, but they do something else. So this duality, which he quotes as the dichotomy, it plays out really well through his book that's published in 1949, which also leads to his other book, which is on leadership in administration in 1957. So the broad work on institutional theory starts germinating from Philip Selznick and also Parsons' work on universalistic rules and authority. So what it means by universalistic rules is that they believed in that rationality is universal, right? So rational man, they were aspiring or they were talking about a rational man, and the way how you really rationalize things are universal. So it's mainly shaped up through organization structures, rules and regulations. So this is the thinking pattern that really germinated and kept evolving under institutional theory. And then we see in late 1970s, with the seminal work of Meyer and Rowan, institutional logics theory takes it takes a cognitive turn. So their thinking pattern totally shifts from Selznick's and the other old institutional theorists' work. So they take a different shape, different turn here, especially by introducing the theory of isomorphism. I know Professor Tarusha too described what isomorphism means. So we know isomorphism means a process where an entity becomes very similar to the field or to the other entities, the similar looking entities in the same industry or maybe the market that they operate in, they look alike, right? The organizational structures they adopt and the goals that they set up, the decision-making styles, they are shaped up in a common pattern. So they take they basically look similar from one, so similar to the other, right? So if you look at Meyer and Rowan's work, so here the variant that they introduce through institutional theory is dominant in terms of culture. So here they underscore the importance of culture, how cultural structures, how patterns that are existing in culture shapes individual and organizational behavior. So Meyer and Rowan takes a macro perspective, trying to see society from a macro point of view and trying to see how culture, what's the role of culture in organizations and in individuals who are working in these organizations. So we see that say these three terms which I have given here, institutional rules, or that would lead to conformity. So you conform with the institutional rules and regulations. So institutional rules, legitimacy, it leads to isomorphism. So why do organizations look alike? Because they believe in this universal rationality here too. And this universal rationality, which is expressed through the cultural structures, would force these institutional actors to go by the rules. So they have to play by the rules. And as such, their actions, their decisions would conform with the rules that are established. And it is also seen as a sign of gaining legitimacy. Now, drawing from Max Weber's idea on bureaucracy and Emil Durkheim's idea on structure. So they, especially through Max Weber's bureaucracy, legitimacy is seen as a source of gaining power. So if you want to say be in good books of your stakeholders, right, and to appear that maybe to secure investment, maybe to secure business, you would aspire to gain that legitimacy. So legitimate organizations were the emphasis that was given in neo-institutional theory. So in 1970s, what Meyer and Rowan suggested is what we call as neo-institutional theory, right? So because they took a different turn. And when all organizations, they play by the rules, they follow the institutional rules, they conform to them, they gain legitimacy, and as a result, all these organizations would look the same. So that is how conformity leads to legitimacy and isomorphism. So in explaining this process, excuse me, just stop here. Sorry about that. So through conformity, legitimacy, and isomorphism. So especially when organizational institutional rules were adopted, sometimes organizations had to really say decouple, or they had to detach the rules from the core activities of the organization, because they were not on par or they were not compatible. but to gain that legitimacy in the face of the powerful stakeholders, and to show that the institution or the organization is legitimate, right? They had to either decouple or they had to loosely couple the parts of organizations. That is how they saw that organization success can be attained. So there are instances where when say you have the mission and the vision and then you have the goals that are set are not compatible or not aligned with the organization's real core activities. So then you had to put aside or keep aside the formalities and then run the core organizational functions to make the organization efficient. So you had to really detach these two and then proceed. So there were incompatibilities when it comes to say following rules, right? So this is again another interesting point that we come across when we talk about neo-institutional theory, especially that's presented through Maya and Rowan. And Sackler, she took a different perspective. She underscored the importance of ideation, the cognition, the thinking process, and took a micro perspective to institutional analysis. But in both, in both these approaches, the macro as well as the micro that's presented in these early 1970s, late 1970s, had this feature in common. So all these thinking patterns on institutional theory were revolving around cultural isomorphism. And in early 1980s, in 1983, through the seminal work of DiMaggio and Walter Powell, so Paul DiMaggio and Walter Powell, they extended this theory of isomorphism into institutional fields. So we will look at what institutional fields shortly. And they identified three forms of structural isomorphism: coercive, normative, and mimetic. So coercive again relates with rules, going by the rules and the regulations. Normative are the norms, going by the norms, the commonly accepted practices that are there in the society. And then mimetic is you try to copy or emulate another organization or what other individuals are doing. So these are the three forms of structural isomorphism. So what we see as a difference from what Maya and Rowan, Sackler introduced from DiMaggio and Powell's idea is that here Maya and Rowan gave prominence to cultural isomorphism, whereas DiMaggio and Powell stressed on structural isomorphism. So they identified structures, institutional structures, to give the legitimacy for the organizations. But especially with these ideas, institutional theory got so popular, and it really helped the empirical research to proliferate. So the research and also theoretical development really mushroomed. These mushrooming research and theory development led to a lot of publications. But with time, there were seeds of discontent that were growing among the institutional theorists because the lack of agency, or maybe agency, we will see what agency means. It's the autonomy, the freedom the institutional actors gain in behaving in organizations. So they overly emphasized on structure, culture, but that didn't really allow the capacity for the institutional actors, the organizational actors, individuals and organizations didn't have that freedom, motivation to really unleash their creativity. So both these theoretical perspectives on new institutional theory or new institutionalism talks about isomorphism. So it talks about homogeneity, right? All these organizations looking alike, conformity, legitimacy. These were the key concepts that were evolving and emphasized during new institutionalism. So as there weren't, possibilities for institutional actors to really use their capacity in terms of tearing down institutions, changing institutions, this idea was introduced by Friedland and Alfords, by Roger Friedland's and by Robert Alford's seminal work that was published in DiMaggio and Powell's edited book called the New Institutionalism in Organization Analysis. So they published it as a chapter, identifying, they critique the structural isomorphism, and they tried to show that that there needs to be freedom for organizational actors to unleash their creativity, their innovation in changing, and also in maybe tearing down the institutions that were not compatible and introducing new institutions. So this is the idea that is introduced through institutional logics, the novelty of institutional logics. They brought in the need for agency, the need for individual freedom, autonomy in changing organizations. So institutional logics perspective was further developed by Thornton and Ocasio, and also through Scott's work. So we will look at those developments later on. Okay, so after going through how institutional theory evolved up to institutional logics perspective, going through those developments, different development stages, institutional logics is, again, you need to understand that this is embedded within institutional theory, but it has its own distinct characteristics that we will look at shortly, how it differentiates from the overall institutional logics perspective. So in order to do that, let us first see what institutional logics mean. Institutional logics, as Thornton and Ocasio put it, is socially constructed historical patterns of material practices, assumptions, values, beliefs, and rules by which individuals produce and reproduce. Now here we come through this term again. Produce and reproduce their material subsistence, organize time and space, and provide meaning to their social reality. So the institutional logics are embedded within institutions. I hope you can recall most of these terms they were there when we tried to identify what institutions are, right? So again, institutional logics are socially constructed. These are constructed by people, by individuals in society, and it's contingent, or it's dependent on historical patterns of both material and symbolic practices, right? Including assumptions, values, beliefs, which shapes up individuals and organizations' behavior. So in order to understand, make meaning, and make sense of what we are doing, institutional logics would be providing us frames of reference, right? So again, producing and reproducing repeats here to highlight that these behaviors are patterns. So we are not talking about any decision that you spontaneously take out of the blue. No, we are talking about the organizational patterns, how the styles of organizational decision-making, leadership, and how organizations are navigated in, say, in dealing with their especially in trying to attain their organizational objectives and goals. Another way Thornton, Ocasio, and Lounsbury interpret institutional logics is that institutional logics are frames of references that conditions actors' choices for sense making. So here, these are terms of or frames of references where you can rely on in interpreting and in making sense of, say, organizational behavior and the vocabularies that they use and how they make sense of their identity, individuals' self-identity as well as organizational identity. So how these identities are shaped up, how they are say constituted, can be identified through institutional logics. Right? The other important thing here you need to identify is that they bring in that rationality is not universal. So by this idea on institutional logics, we will come to that later on when we get into the fundamentals of the meta-theoretical principles. So they identify that there's no one way of one dominant overarching rationality which would justify human and organizational behavior. Rather, it's these institutional logics that would play out and show the interplay between how organizational members, organizations make sense of their reality. So there are multiple realities. That is another novelty that was introduced through institutional logics perspective. And it is also called, institutional logics is also seen as a meta-theoretical framework for analyzing the interrelationships among institutions, individuals, and organizations in society. This is where I really took my today's title. So it's a meta-theoretical framework for analyzing the interrelationships among institutions, individuals, and organizations in society. So why is it called a meta-theory? Let's see. Now, a meta-theory is a theory which integrates many other theories. So why is it called a meta-theory? Because the institutional logics perspective draws on many theories in sociology and mainly in social sciences and it augments, it really shed light on trying to see these interconnections, interrelationships in a much better perspective, right? So that is why institutional logics perspective is considered as a meta-theory, right? And it is also identified as a meta-theoretical framework because of these 5 fundamental characteristics, right, that are put forth by Friedland and Alford. The first is embedded agency. So I will take you through these 5 characteristics, right, these principles. After I just go through, I just introduce these 5 to you. So the first is embedded agency, which talks about the duality of structure and agency. And the second is society as an inter-institutional system. The third is institutions as material and symbolic. The fourth one is institutions as historically contingent. And the last one is institutions at multiple levels of analysis. Right? So these are the 5 principles that qualify, that leads to enable us to identify institutional logics perspective as a meta-theoretical framework. Let's have a look at the embedded agency, the duality of structure versus action. So here agency means action. Right? So Scott defines agency as an actor's ability to have some effect on the social world. So this is basically the motivation or maybe the autonomy. Actors. Who are actors? These are individuals and organizations, as we discussed earlier. So the autonomy, the freedom, the motivation these individuals and organizations enjoy in making sense of the social world is what we mean by agency, right? And in neo-institutional theory, right, they gave primacy for structure over agency. So they, especially through the neo-institutionalism that was introduced by DiMaggio and Fowler, they identified structures, organizational structures, say the rules, the regulations, the norms, and the patterns that they adopted to be at the core, right? They give prominence to structure. And as a result, they didn't really see the potential of organizational actors in, putting forth their, or in really enabling organizational actors' autonomy. So that was suppressed, and you gave prominence to the structures, right? So actors were implicitly assumed to have a limited degree of agency. They had a limited degree of freedom in changing organizations because their overarching idea was about homogeneity, right? They talked about organizations that look alike. So you go by the standards, you go by the rules, and you then look the same as your, maybe the rival that's who's there in the industry. So you look legitimate. So, and you gain power through that. So if you were, say, the first to, say, come up with an idea, introduce it to the agency, you got that competitive advantage. Afterwards, it diffused. It was shared among the other players in the industry, or maybe in the market that you're looking at, and they then be alike. Now, if you look at, say, accounting and reporting, especially in financial reporting, you see that if you are to gain this legitimacy, organizations, they follow the GRI standards, right? Global Reporting Initiative. So these are through professions, through state regulations, you give a set of rules and regulations. You set the framework for the organizational actors to act upon. And you make sure that all these organizations look alike. If you are to really win the hearts of maybe your investors and potential investors, and to gain, basically to gain legitimacy, right? So as a result, it did not account well for the possibility of change. So heterogeneity, change was not discussed. So more oftenly what was emphasized was on homogeneity, right? And we come across, when we read literature, we come across that social science history. If you look back social science history, there is this ongoing debate on paradox of embedded agency among scholars, right? Paradox of embedded agency. Embedded agency, why we call this embedded agencies, through institutional logic's perspective, they embed agency, they include these actors, they give that autonomy for the actors. Institutional logic's perspective is all about heterogeneity, how organizations really change from, say, how they come up with different ideas, how different are these organizational actors who really come together in an organizational setting, right? Because they belong to different organizational orders. We will look at that later on, but for the time being, there is a disparity, or you also call it the agency, the structure agency dichotomy. This is a duality. So structure versus action, structure versus agency, right? So giving you if you look at, say, the rational theory, And if you look at, here I have given you some of the theories. Theory of structuration, that's introduced by Anthony Giddens, and theory of practice introduced by Pierre Bourdieu. So these are some of the theories that try to transcend the idea from structure to action, right? So due to certain subjectivity, ambiguity, there were criticisms about these theories, but if you look at social theories on rational choice and mostly the structuration. In theory of structuration, what it says is structures would shape up individual behavior, organizational behavior, and vice versa. The organizational behavior could change organization structures. So the paradox between agency versus structure dichotomy is that scholars began to ask if it is the structures which shapes up the agencies or maybe the actors' role, how can the actors who are in these organizations, in these actors who are stuck within these organizational frames, institutional frames, how can they influence, say, the institutions, right? Because their behaviors, their thought patterns are all shaped through the structure, right? Through the structure. So how can they go against these patterns of behavior? That is what we mean by the paradox of embedded agency. So depending on how these social theories, whether they tilt more towards the structure side or more towards the action side, the agency side, their interpretations differ. But the speciality of institutional logics perspective is they embrace and they accept the idea of agency, because agency is embedded in these institutional logics that we are talking about. So ILP, institutional logics perspective, is distinct from other orienting strategies as it explains the partial autonomy of actors from social structure. So they believe in that the actors, the organization individuals and the organizations themselves have that freedom in changing organizational patterns, right? So that is embedded agency. We should continue more, connect it more towards the ILP. So through this side, I will show you how it really connects with the institutional logics perspective. So institutional logics perspective fills up this void. So there is a gap because a greater priority was given on structure over agency through neo-institutional theory. But here, Friedland and Alford, they critique this structural isomorphism and they situated these actors in a broader societal context. So that is what is special about institutional logics perspective. A core premise of ILP is that the interests, identities, values, assumptions of individuals and organizations they are embedded within the prevailing logics. Decisions, the outcomes are as a result of this interplay between individual agency and institutional structure. So you combine the two, you combine agency and structure through institutional logics perspective. How individual and organizational actors have influenced by their situation in multiple social locations in an inter-institutional system is what is seen through the institutional logics perspective that will be discussed shortly. So here the actors will reproduce, they will produce and reproduce the existing institutional logics or innovate and thus transform institutional logics. So as we empower the actors, so their thinking patterns, their ideation, their ideologies can be injected into how organizations behave, how institutions shape organizational behavior. So jumping into conclusions, trying to identify these set of behaviors are rational, these set of behaviors are irrational, rather than jumping into conclusions. What is emphasized through institutional logics perspective is you observe why these individuals behave the way they do, because there is no one dominating, overarching rationality. And we believe in multiple rationalities. So you dig deeper and see what's the background of these individuals? Why do they behave the way they do before making judgments about rationality or irrationality? So that's the difference between other social theories, even neo-institutional theory and institutional logics perspective. You go by the logics that play out. The meaning of rationality varies by institutional order. So here we come across a new term called institutional orders. So institutional orders are same as the institutions that I identified. Institutional orders are family, the state, religion, the corporate, the market, and then the community, right? So these institutional orders have their own way of making sense of rationality, right? And therefore their behaviors are shaped up through those institutional logics that are fostered and that are shaped up through these different institutional orders. Each institutional order in the inter-institutional system distinguishes unique organizational principles, practices, and symbols that influence individual and organizational behavior. So this is the key of it, the core of it. So institutional logics perspective, rather tilting towards structure or agency, right? We take an integrated approach, okay? So this reminds me of the analogy of, say, as I was talking about a journey and I showed you the roadmap. Now imagine that we take a trip to hill country. Maybe we go on a trip to Nuwara. I hope most of you may have been to Nuwara, so you might recall, you just mentally visualize when you go through those winding roads and when you go on to the top of the hill or the mountain that you climb, then the more you go to the top, that you tend to see the houses, the winding roads beneath you, and that this elevated picture nicely shows you the interconnections, right? It's like going to a mountaintop and trying to see the world around you. So when you are at the ground, you don't see those interconnections. But when you climb to the top, when you go to the top of the hill, then you, with that elevated view, you tend to see those connections very beautifully. So it's the same thing that we try to do, the institutional logics theories try to do through institutional logics perspective to make it more easier to understand. And the second principle why we identify institutional logics perspective to be a meta theory is that we see the society as an interplay of these different institutions. Remember, we talked about institutional orders. So the society is seen as an interplay of these different institutional orders, right? So this is one of the key contributions of institutional logics perspective that was not identified or seen earlier. Society is seen as an inter-institutional system comprised of varied institutional orders such as family, religion, state, market, corporation, community, and professions. So through ILP, these 7 institutional logics, or institutional orders are introduced. And each of these institutional orders have their own logic as to how you justify your behavior. It allows sources of heterogeneity and agency to be theorized and to be observed from the contradictions among logic of different institutional orders. So you see how these institutional orders would conform with each other, would nicely say, integrate with each other, coexist with each other, and also you will see how these institutions, these inter-institutional orders would clash with each other, would come in conflict with each other. So you see the beauty of the interplay through looking at the society as an inter-institutional system. Neo-institutional theory is limited in scope to the diffusion and reproduction of successfully institutionalized organizational forms and practices. Without a theory of interest and agency, it cannot explain the origins, reproduction, and disappearance of institutions. So reiterating, in neo-institutional theory, they emphasized the institutionalized organizations. So you try to gain legitimacy, you try to be like the other who's ahead of the game, right? So as a result, the novelty, the disruptive thinking, the creativity was not given a chance, right? So, and they also believed in one dominant logic, the overarching logic of rationality, which incorporated market, state, professional logic, professional sources. Now, even when you look at literature that's published using neo-institutional theory, and also look at Meyer and Rowan's argument, as well as DiMaggio and Powell's arguments, you see that they talk about the state, they talk about professions, and especially with this, with the idea on fields, the structural isomorphism that was introduced by DiMaggio and Powell. They brought in the logic of market. But the difference here is, even though they talked about state, market, professions, they all these institutional orders had one rationality. So go by the rules, play by the rules, go by the standards. So they had one overarching rationality. You see one dominant logic. But with the introduction of the ILP, the institutional logics perspective, this is challenged. So this is shunned, and they bring in the multiple rationalities through different institutional orders. So this is one of the key contributions of institutional logics perspective to the, say, in analyzing institutions. And the third principle that enable us to look at institutional logics perspective as a meta theory is that this is a combination of material here means the structures and practices, and both the symbolic aspects of culture, right? So ideations and meanings, your thinking patterns, the cognition. So it's a connection, it's a combination of both material and symbolic aspects, right? So it's an interplay of the two. A key distinction between institutional logics perspective and early neo-institutional theory, is this combination, the twinning of both material and symbolic foundations, right? Difficulty in theorizing institutional heterogeneity and change without symbols. So what it means is, now without symbols, because in neo-institutionalism, they gave prominence to structures and practices over, say, ideation, over culture, especially in DiMaggio and Powell's variant on institutional theory, right? Through structural isomorphism, they gave greater prominence to structures and practices, but then that would not really encourage the creativity and also the heterogeneity and change. So organizations, institutions, all would look alike. They would all do the same, but there is no change. How theory development happens along with change was not really discussed. Looks at how culture and cognition shape action. So here we look at both, say, culture symbols, they shape up the actions, they influence the material practices and vice versa, right? And institutional logic's perspective considers the dynamics of both material and symbolic. Why? Because now, say for example, we tend to think, and also that is the idea that was put forth by, say, neo-institutional theorists, that yeah, we see in society the institution called family and religion, but they have nothing to do with, say, when it comes to business or when it comes to, say, making decisions regarding the markets, right? So this idea was challenged because that might be true to some extent in the Western cultures, but here it opens up the possibility to really permeate into even Eastern cultures, where we see, we will get to that example, which I will take you through, which will really show how really family and religion shapes up even business decisions, right? They would play out in other spheres in the society. So now this cannot be accepted if you adopt a neo-institutional theory approach, because neo-institutional theory gave prominence to material practices, structures and practices, by shunning off, like they would put aside the symbolic aspect of it, right? Which was challenged and by the institutional logic's perspective. And so we see a dominance in market and corporate culture in the cultural sphere. We see that markets, corporates dominate. So this idea was challenged through the institutional logic's perspective by embedding or by integrating both material and cultural foundations in their interpretations. The next one is institutions are historically contingent. These institutions depend on historical engagements. So these are, when we discussed about institutions, remember, when we defined them, we defined it as historical patterns of behavior, right? Which are passed along from one generation to the other. So the importance of an institutional order within the, it shows the importance of an institutional order within the interinstitutional system is not a given, but it varies over time. And the other point that you need to identify is that these institutional orders, their ways of making sense of rationality evolves, change during time, over time. Modern societies are typically more influenced by the logics of the state, professions and corporations and markets. So this connects with the idea about combining material and cultural foundations. So, I mean, even though modern societies take the form of, they embrace the state, profession, corporation, market logics, there are nuances, there are subtleties that you can observe that is infused through religion and family logics as well. So if you go by the typical neo-institutional theory, these nuances cannot be captured. Remember the analogy of going on to a top of hill and then trying to see the connections. So these principles will enable you to identify those nuances as to how would religion play out and how would the family play out, even in an organizational setting, in making their decisions, in setting up the goals, etc. Basically in governing the behavior. And the historical contingencies of institutional logics emerge. So they emerge, re-emerge, and then they change with time. However, one institutional order does not completely replace another. So here, these institutional orders are distinct from one to the other. So you can't imagine how family would replace religion over time. No, it doesn't happen, because the institutional, say, the society is seen as and the connection of these different institutional orders, these different institutions, but they won't override the other. They are sometimes they can be more prominent than the other, but they won't replace, not override, sorry, no, they won't replace the other. So this is what we mean by historically contingent. The things keep, I mean, the patterns keep changing, patterns keep evolving with time. The last principle, which helps us to identify institutional logic's perspective as a meta theory, is that institutions are seen at multiple levels, right? So as a result, it enables us to do a meta-analysis at different levels, starting off with the individual level and then moving on to organizational level to the societal level, right? So institutional logic's perspective assumes that institutions operate at multiple levels of analysis and actors are nested in higher order levels. So actors are nested at all these levels and you try to see how it plays out at different levels: individual, organizational, incorporating field to societal. Now here we come across this term field, organizational fields that are introduced by DiMaggio and Powell, right? They define organizational fields as those organizations. So they are organizations, but they come in an aggregate. They are a collection of organizations that constitute a recognized area of institutional life. So sometimes I have still like not very clear whether it alludes to an industry or a market, right? So, but it definitely, the idea that you can get out of this is that it's a collection of organizations which really identifies a similar pattern among the similar organizations. So it includes the key suppliers, resources, product consumers, regulatory agencies, and other organizations that produce similar services or products. So this is what we mean by organizational fields that's introduced by these two scholars. So institutional logic's perspective can be applied at different levels to see how, organizational behavior evolves and organizational behavior is shaped up. The levels of analysis will assist the researcher's selection of problems and tools as well in investigating a problem, and thus what they are likely to observe. So we know that even though, sometimes research might not allow you to look at all these levels, but if you can incorporate your maybe the study that you want to do, including at least one or two levels, right? How the individuals can translate their influences on organizations and how that translates to the greater society. That would show the true picture, that would show the reality much in a better sense. Research combining multiple levels will provide a more accurate picture, enabling to visualize the interplay of institutional logics. Complements with Friedland and Alford's motivation in introducing the idea of interinstitutional system. So remember, in one of the principles that we discussed earlier, where we identified society to be an interinstitutional system, it is compatible with these multiple levels of analysis. So the institution consists of many different institutional orders, and these institutional orders can influence organizational these organizations and organizational members at different levels. At an individual level, going beyond that organizational level, and then diffusing it to the society. So I think that brings us as to look at the proliferation of institutional logic's perspective into different areas. Before that, let me recall. So all this time, we discussed how we identify institutional logic's perspective as a meta theory. So embedded agency is one aspect of it, the duality of structure agency. You integrate, you try to bring in both agency and structure into the discussion of institutional logics. And institutional logics also contributes to look at the society as an inter-institutional system. And it also enables to integrate both material and cultural aspects. And we know that these institutional logics, the frames of references, are subject to change with time, which is given by this fourth principle. And finally, institutions would operate at multiple levels. So depending on which level we try to focus, the influence is different and it varies based on the different levels it play out, right? So these are the 5 fundamental principles which qualify institutional logics perspective to take a meta-theoretical framework, meta-theoretical approach. Let's go back to the slide we are supposed to do next. So when you look at institutional logics perspective and its applications, we see an array of variety of fields, right, including higher education. So I have given you some of the just one reference to denote each, to identify each. So there are studies, empirical studies, that have looked at institutional logics perspective in the higher education publishing. This is a seminal work done by Thornton and Ocasio, where there are inferences, the insights are very much useful in making sense and also helping in terms of identifying how really institutional logics help us to really see how the interplay of these different logics in action, right? Using this higher education publishing study. And there are also research done in healthcare, in the field of insurance, in the field of commercial and microfinance, organizational philanthropy, colleges and universities, accounting firms. And I would also, I would like to mention our colleagues, Dr. Sujivas and Professor Tarusha's work. This is a review, this is not an empirical study, on management accounting practices, which shows a review about how management accounting practices have adapted institutional logics. So with that, I will take you to my study, which I did for my PhD, and where I got to use institutional logics perspective in trying to see how, say, organizations with a Buddhist ethos find their way to sustainability. So even though this was done for my PhD, I got it published just recently. It comes in as a book chapter in this edited book. So in this study, which I try to examine how, how organizations with the Buddhist, Buddhist inclination. So I will get to the crux of it, trying to make you aware as to how I went by, like how I selected these organizations as cases in my method. But here what I try to look at is how these organizations which are inclined towards a particular, ethos, especially that's influenced through Buddhism, because we know that when you consider the Sri Lankan society, Buddhism plays a very prominent role, and it really permeates many spheres of Sri Lankans' lives, be it politics, be it education, be it culture. So how this prevalence is played out in the business organizations. In one of my previous studies, I have looked at how, say, a Buddhist orientation would shape up the individual managers who oversee sustainability initiatives in these companies, whether the orientation, Buddhist orientation would come in their way, would be whether it's an obstacle for them, or whether it enables them to unleash their capacity in being more sustainable and initiating sustainable initiatives in an organizational setting. But here I give greater emphasis on organizational level. I wanted to see how these individuals who really act in organizations, whether they are in a position to, as an organization, transcend the organizational boundary to the societal level, and translate their thoughts, their behavior to shape up the societal action as well, right? So this is going from an organizational level to the societal level. Remember the multiple levels of analysis. So the analysis is situated mainly at organizational level, and it goes beyond that to societal level. So this paper examines how 4 entrepreneurial organizations inspired by a Buddhist ethos embrace institutional logics to pursue social change for sustainability in Sri Lanka. So the cases demonstrate the ripple out effect of spirituality on organizational forms and practices, and shows the potential for wider social change towards sustainability. To investigate how the interplay of institutional logics influence organizational practices and identities of these organizations in the pursuit of sustainability in a Buddhist country context. So that is why I selected these 4 organizations that has an influence either through all 4 had very strong devoted Buddhist leaders as initiators, and they adopted the Buddhist ethos. The Buddhist logic was very prominent. So this connected with spirituality, sustainability, and institutional logics. So when you look at these 3 concepts, 3 ideas, sustainability is also on par. It also takes on a similar approach, highlighting that sustainability has to be dealt as a multi-level approach. So as an individual, you need to foster these thoughts on sustainability. And then as individuals, we need to influence the organizations and the societies. So it was compatible with the ideation of institutional logics perspective, which also took the same approach. And sustainability from alternative perspectives. So here I brought in Buddhism because to add to the novelty of my doctoral study, because sustainability, we know that I'm not sure how many of you are Buddhist, but if you go through the Buddhist doctrine as a philosophy, as a way of life, I'm not referring to the religion here, but as a philosophy, there's a lot of common ground connecting the Buddhist thought, the philosophy, with sustainability. So instead of going by the mundane approaches, I thought, why not taking the lens of Buddhism and trying to see how Buddhism impacts or affects, how it shapes up the organizations, the individuals in these organizations, either to be more sustainable or whether it would really come in as an obstacle or a challenge for them. So this introduces that. So the 3 main concepts to the study: sustainability, Buddhism, and institutional logics, right? So I used institutional logics as my theoretical lens to see the society, the Sri Lankan society, as an inter-institutional system as I told you, Buddhism affects many spheres of our lives, and then the corporate sector stands to be very secular, right? Because it was very, sometimes I had a lot of tension in terms of securing interviews, because when you hear the topic, Buddhism and sustainability and organizations, say some of the like the people who were in businesses were like taken out of surprise. What are you talking about Buddhism in business, sustainability? So most of them found it to be very fascinating, because this was an area which they tend to overlook, and which really opened up them to reflect on their own stance and how they really take on their, say, like their behavior in the organizational settings and beyond. So it was a novel topic for the business men to, and also the business people to really delve into. So it was interesting, but it was challenging at the same time. So this is the context which I really locate my study in. And if I refer to the research gap, so literature says that Buddhist principles, values promote the integration of the three spheres in sustainability, economy, environment, and the society. And it also assists in identifying causes of unsustainability and creating possibilities for sustainability. Here, what I refer to is the Buddhist doctrine, and it connects between Buddhism and sustainability at a societal level. So it helps the connection, to build the connection at a societal level, because the Buddhist logic is a societal aspect. So with this literature, right, I understood that, okay, Buddhism has, say, an influence, or it shapes up it has a connection with sustainability, and it takes a multiple approach, and it also situates in the broader society. So why not then looking at does or does not Buddhism inform sustainability thinking and practice? So here I use both cognition and also the practice, the application at organizational level, right? How does Buddhism play out as an institutional logic? How does it shape up organizational actors' behavior at an organizational level and even beyond? So this is the research gap I tried to explore through this study. And in doing this, I used 4 cases, 2 for-profits. I have obtained the organization's permission to really disclose their name. So I used the 2 family-oriented companies, BSI and Melbourne, as the 2 for-profit cases, and 2 not-for-profit organizations were Sarvodaya and social say movement called Henasuaya to be the other organization, not-for-profit organization. So we all know that in not-for-profits, especially if they are social movements, Buddhism would sit very squarely. It's very direct. So sometimes social movements are totally inspired by spirituality or maybe Buddhism, and that really connects them with it. But in the business context, it was very challenging. It was hard. Sometimes it was hard to find a common ground. So purposely, I tried to see organizations that had leaders and also had current leaders who are strong Buddhists, so that they can really influence Buddhist ethos in their organizational practices. Right? So I found these 2 for-profits and not for the 2 social movements in this study. And I conducted 23 on-site interviews. I also used documentary sources as my data. So if you look at, if I take you through the key findings of how the multiple logics within these 4 cases. So these are the 2 not-for-profit organizations. These are the 2 for-profit organizations. How the interplay of different logics shaped up the, say, the organizational identity and then their practices, right? So I have not included the identity part here, which I will explain. But in these cases, in the 2 not-for-profit, the social movements, these are the institutional logics that were very prominent, right? At Hellosphere, so you might notice that all these 4 organizations, be it profit or not-for-profit, they had Buddhist logic at the core. And in addition to that, at Hellosphere, they had the community logic and the market logic as well, because these were not charities. They had a business model, right? Because they didn't want to call themselves as businesses though. So they tried to identify themselves as a social enterprise rather. So they, even Hellosphere, they sell their products at a profit, at a price. And so they therefore cater to the market, and the market was a part of it, of both these. So at Sarvodaya, the diversity was greater. So in addition to the community, market, and the Buddhist logic, they also had state coming in, especially with the regulations, because they had foster homes, like childcare homes, and also they were into many areas of social activities. So social mandates, regulations were part of the institutional logics that shaped up the organizational behavior at Sarvodaya. And in addition to that, they also had professional logic. This was not quite prominent, but as they drew the connection and say the involvement of professionals, because this was like they wanted volunteers. There were volunteers who were professionals who took part in the decision-making process of this organization. Professional logics also played out in the interplay of logics. So we see some of the logics, especially when you read literature, the most common conflicting logics are market and community. So they come in conflict, or they clash with each other. There are tensions when you try to go ahead with market logic as well as community logic. So, but now here we see that market logic was very much in existence. I mean, we coexist, very peacefully coexist with the community logic, right? Because especially at Hellosphere, they say their thinking pattern, the organizational actors' commitment was so huge. So they even they had practices like meditation being part and parcel of their organizational practices. Every morning they all meditate together. So they have that spiritual combination, like the glue that it's like the glue that keeps them together. So they are, if you look at the nature of the organizational practices, especially the sustainable practices, they took more of a spiritual approach, a systemic approach, systemic in the sense they had a very holistic approach. Now, this is an organization that encourages organic farming. So they introduce organic fertilizer, and they also have, say, networks of farmers, growers who are producing their produce using organic agricultural practices. And they combine that with the spiritual aspect, right? So, which is very fascinating. Sometimes you might tend to think whether these would hold and gain currency in business. but it is an emerging area. If you look at the Academy of Management, MSR, Management, Spirituality and Religion is gaining a lot of traction. It is an emerging area. So it's not just scientific thinking that gains that legitimacy, but also non-scientific thinking, like especially the organization on Hellesuaya, when, say, during the interviews with the initiator, the founder of this organization, so the person was explaining how they get connected with deities at a different level through meditation practice, and how they get insights and ideas as to how they should run their social business, right? Their social movement. So it's very connected. The sustainability practices that they adopt had a very strong spiritual orientation, and their approach was very holistic and systemic, in the sense they address all levels. So they individually, they try to be very spiritual, and then emanate the good vibes to the organization that they work for, and then they try to spread the word out to the community and make the community a part of the sustainability approach. Why should we rely on chemicals? So why can't we switch to a more organic, more healthy lifestyle? So they were trying to really incorporate practices which are very systemic, right? So meaning it addresses all levels, and also very all these practices. Sustainability was at the core of both these organizations, at Hellesuaya as well as Sarvodaya. But on the contrary, so you see, taking these two family-oriented businesses, Maliban and DSI, here the complexity, like at Sarvodaya, the interplay of institutional logics was complex. So they had the business logic, why I plugged in business instead of corporate, because these are private organizations, so it's not fair to identify these as corporates. So I used the business logic here. So as an entity, they were focusing on the market logic, the Buddhist logic, and they had this strong extended family logic, influencing their business decisions, especially at the strategic level. So I remember at an interview where I think it was the DSI person who stated that the founder has the founder has said that they would never get into the 5 areas where Buddha has said not to do business in: sale of liquor, sale of meat products, likewise sale of humans, or like for slavery, prostitution. All these were areas that they would keep away, because they, at the strategic level, they went by this Buddhist ethos, which they saw that helped them to make their business practices more sustainable. That is how they put it. So, but if you see how these different logics play out and how they shape up the practices, rather spiritual, they had a more managerial take on more managerial orientation in their business practices, obviously being a business organization. And they were rather systemic. They were more focused on the entity, the company itself, the business itself. So not really, influencing at the individual level or the societal level. They had certain programs that really helped them through the Buddhist logic to get engaged with the community. So, I mean, there was a push of Buddhist logic, community logic, to make them more sustainable. But their approach comparatively to the two not-for-profit organizations, their practices were entity focused, right? And sustainability, now I told you sustainability was at the core of at Hellasware and Sarvodaya, but sustainability was a peripheral, say, consideration, or maybe they wanted to be a sustainable business. They identify themselves as a sustainable business, but if you look at the overall the decision making arena, sustainability was at a peripheral level, not at the core. So these are the differences, the nuances that I was able to identify by applying institutional logics, how these institutional logics play out in their decision making. So there were instances where some of the organizational decision makers were, facing challenges because of this Buddhist ethic, because of the community ethic. Because I remember in one of these organizations, the person who I interviewed was saying that the founder has, it was I think at Melbourne, so they see the founder identifies quality as the religion. So quality is our religion. This is the saying that I still remember, which really struck me and which really connects with me. So they identify quality to be the religion. So with that Buddhist influence, the Buddhist emphasis, they try to see how they try to use that as a lens in terms of doing business. So they always believed in good quality. They would never compromise on quality. And in terms of not really conflicts, but the tension they had was, the founder has said never to retaliate. Do not attack your rival head on. No, never. Even through marketing or the decisions that you make in terms of finding strategic positions in positioning, in market positioning, never retaliate your rival head on, right? You never do that because it's considered as totally unethical. So these sustainability practices were either brought in, was introduced through this Buddhist logic, founders being strong Buddhists. So we saw, I was able to see how these institutional logics play out and justifies their organizational practices and behavior. So in concluding, the insights I drew from this study was that all these four organizations had the prominent Buddhist logic in common, but they also had to see how these other institutional logics plays out in decision making and in business operations. And the other important aspect is the adoption of the 5 precepts. All 4 organizations were seeing these 5 precepts that we meet in Buddhist doctrine to be their guiding principle. So they had the 5 precepts as their guiding framework, like the guiding principle. But at the same time, we were able to see how the other logics come in conflict and live in harmony with the rest. Right? So these were the common things that we identified. And in terms of the differences, the alignment of Buddhist logic with the purpose, the alignment of Buddhist logics was different, as I earlier showed you. At these not-for-profit organizations, it was at the core, but in the 2 business organizations, it was just as a ritual. So as a ritual, now Buddhism played out more as rituals and symbols in Melbourne and DSI, whereas at Helasuva and Sarvodaya, Buddhism was part and parcel of the decisions that they took. And in terms of building up the identity, in terms of interpreting who they are, Buddhism was at the center. But when you look at the two business organizations, they were somewhat decoupled. So you run the business organization, you take the day-to-day mundane business decisions, going by the standards, going by the ISO certification. So you still follow the standards, the regulations, the mandates, and the Buddhism really was like rituals. So they have once, they had annual Pirit ceremonies, religious activities, and almsgiving and all that CSR activities that really revolved around Buddhist logic, community logic, but the crux of it was the business logic, the market logic, right? So these were the differences between the two sets. And the nature of the commitment to sustainability also differed. As I told you, the two business organizations had the commitment at a peripheral level, whereas in the for-profits, it was at the core. And institutional complexity, the complexity differed because with the two for-profit organizations, the complexity was much more because sometimes, say the directors said that they sometimes feel very like they don't have that freedom to. They don't have the freedom to or the autonomy to make decisions, especially when it comes to retaliating, responding to the market forces, because they had to go by the Buddhist ethic. So the complexity between Buddhist logic, community logic, market logic in the two business organizations, but was more. And then there was a clear distinction in terms of the vocabularies they used. When you talk to the two social movements, they reiterated meditation, deities, they get connected with high levels, and compassion, selflessness. Their vocabularies and their practices were totally very, very distinct, very different from the two business organizations. Even though they had their own products, they sold their products, they make a profit, and they paid their employees. So these two social movements were social businesses. So they had a business model, but these two business models were in stark difference from the two for-profit business models. So by applying institutional logics, that was this diversity was beautifully identified. So the takeaways from this study are: identification of a Buddhist logic informs how both organizations and their members behave in terms of sustainability. So Buddhist logic has informed their practices, their commitment to sustainability. But the second one, despite all four organizations had a prominent Buddhist logic, the interplay of these different institutional logics, right, brought in diversity, right, affected the nature of sustainability practices they adopted, and affected the identities they created as a result. So even though the starting point, like the ground was the same, the nuances played out, there were a lot of subtleties in terms of the two business models, the two sets of organizations adopted. So in conclusion, I would like to recap what I discussed so far. So by reinstating institutional logic is a distinct perspective that builds on, yet departs from new institutional theory. Remember, with the evolution, with the development of institutional theory that we discussed, using the different chronological, like the different chronological order, or the age, the different stages that are highlighted. I tried to make it more clear as to how institutional logics perspective was built on institutional theory, but
one because when I was 20 years old.
It still has its own distinction because it embeds, as we discussed, it embeds both agency and structure. It integrates both culture and material practices, and it looks at the society as an interinstitutional setting. Right? So this is a meta theory as it integrates a variety of social science theories like structuration theory, agency theory, institutional entrepreneurship, rational theory. It connects, it integrates these theories to better understand how institutions shape up these different levels, individuals, organizational, and societal relationships. Institutional logics perspective provides a new approach that incorporates macro structure, culture, and agency through cross-level processes. Cross-level in the sense, again, going by different levels, individual, organizations, fields, society. That explains how institutions both enable and constrain action. Institutions, but we need to keep in mind that but we discuss all about institutions, be it institutionalization, institutional logics. These are the different analytical tools that scholars use as a modest attempt of these scholars. They adapt to interpret and explain the seemingly confusing and conflating issues about society. So these are different lenses that we put on, like the different glasses that we put on to look at the society, the interconnections of the society in a different way, right? So all these are in the heads of people, all these are socially constructed. These are different types of lenses we use to identify the patterns existing and emerging within a society to make sense of the interrelationships. So going back to my title, Institutional Logics, a Meta Theory, which helps to look at the broader society, which we see as an interplay of these different institutional orders in a different approach to make meaning and make sense of why these organizational actors behave the way they do in light of these different institutional logics. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. These are some of the references that I have used in my presentation. And I'm now open for questions. I don't know whether I have taken the time I've gone over. So over to you, Arosha.
Shashika, no, you have not gone over at all. A very interesting presentation. Any questions? Any clarifications you need? Any questions, anything? Anybody who's planning to use this theory, or Tarusha, anything you want to comment on this?
No, it was very interesting. That's why, Arosha, I just put a text saying it was really insightful. And as a person who's using this theory, I found it very, very interesting to listen to Shashika. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really nice. And I actually have another meeting, so I will be leaving soon. Yes. That's why I put a message through. Yes, thanks a lot, Tarusha, also for organizing.
Thank you, Tarusha.
Yeah, I wish I had more time to really go through the details of the study, but I think I may have done justice. So, I mean, yes, Pavitra Miss has a question.
Yes, Pavitra Miss.
I think your last slide or one before, when you were summarizing about institutional logics perspective, you said where it's very complex, you can use this to explain other theories or application of other theories? How does that work? I wasn't that clear about that.
No, what I meant means why institutional logics perspective is considered to be a meta theory is because it integrates different theories. So it integrates the theory of structuration, theory of practice by Pierre Bourdieu, and theory of rational choice. So it connects, it integrates these different theories in social sciences to, to take a better approach, to take a better view about organizational behavior, institutional behavior. Not that it conflates different theories, it uses different theories to shed more light on why organizations, people behave the way they do.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So if there are no more comments or questions, Darshini, would you like to say anything, Darshini, and maybe conclude the session also?
Yes, so thank you so much, Dr. Shashika Manoratna, for joining us today. And despite being not very well, and I know all of us are having a lot of work these days, so thank you so much for being with us and for, taking us through this theory, and also, in defining it, in talking about the evolution. I think you just took us through a lot of different things, especially if it was a new one to the audience here. And also nicely relating it to a lot of empirical work and how it has been used, and especially in your work, so that it became very clear how another person, if any one of us are interested in using it, could potentially look at using it and how we could really use it. So I thought that was very interesting. So thank you so much once again. And thank you to all of us who joined us today with this session. And we're looking forward to having all of you in our future sessions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shashika. So we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you all.